The man who shattered her world was the only one there to catch her when it fell apart. Charles Toney, a titan of industry whose name was synonymous with ruthless ambition, could acquire entire city blocks with a single phone call. But as he watched his pregnant ex-wife, the woman he'd sacrificed for his empire, collapse onto the cold airport floor, he was about to discover the one thing he couldn't buy, bargain for, or bully into submission: redemption. And the price would cost him everything. The roar of a departing 747 vibrated through the polished floors of JFK's international arrivals, a sound Charles Toney had always found energizing, a symphony of global commerce and ambition taking flight. Tonight, however, it felt like a dull throb behind his temples, a counterpoint to the gnawing unease that had settled in his gut since his early morning board meeting. Deals worth hundreds of millions hung in the balance, yet his focus kept drifting, snagged on a ghost of a memory, a melody of laughter that hadn't echoed in his life for far too long. He was waiting for a colleague, Andreas, whose flight from Zurich was delayed. Charles, a man who valued efficiency above almost all else, found himself uncharacteristically early, a small tear in the fabric of his meticulously scheduled existence. He leaned against a cool marble pillar, the sharp lines of his bespoke Tom Ford suit a stark contrast to the weary travelers shuffling past in rumpled clothes. His gaze, usually laser-focused on a target, scanned the crowd aimlessly, a sea of faces blurred by jet lag and the hollow fluorescence of the terminal lights. Then he saw her. Even from a distance of 50 yards, something about her silhouette triggered a jolt of recognition, a forgotten chord strummed in the depths of his memory. It was the way her dark, wavy hair cascaded over the shoulders of her simple trench coat, the slight slump of her posture that spoke of a fatigue that went deeper than travel. As she turned, navigating a luggage cart through the throng, her face came into sharp focus. It was a softer, more vulnerable version of the face that still appeared in his dreams, etched with a quiet resilience he had once mistaken for weakness. Serafina. Sarah. His ex-wife. His breath hitched, a sharp, involuntary intake of air. It had been nearly 3 years since their acrimonious divorce, a messy affair, fueled by his relentless pursuit of success, and her quiet despair at being relegated to a footnote in his meticulously planned life. He'd buried the guilt, layered it under 16-hour workdays and the relentless demands of Vance acquisitions, telling himself it was a necessary sacrifice on the altar of greatness. Seeing her now, the past resurfaced with a visceral punch, tearing through the carefully constructed armor of his success. She looked different. There were faint shadows under her eyes he didn't recognize, and a delicate pallor that worried him despite himself. And then his eyes fell lower, and he noticed it. The undeniable, gentle swell beneath her loose-fitting coat. A wave of pure, cold disbelief washed over him, followed by a sickening dread that coiled in his stomach. Pregnancy. It was unmistakable. Logic dictated it wasn't his. Couldn't be his. And yet, a desperate, irrational part of his brain started doing the math, counting back the months to that one night of weakness, of shared loneliness and regrettable nostalgia 8 months ago. Their eyes met across the crowded terminal. He saw the flicker of recognition in her deep brown eyes, the immediate shuttering of her expression as a guarded neutrality fell like a veil. It was a wall he knew all too well. He had built it brick by brick with every missed dinner, every broken promise. He started to move towards her, an instinct he couldn't control, a dozen questions forming on his lips. Sarah? What are you doing here? Are you okay? But before he could take a second step, her hand flew to her forehead, a look of confusion and pain twisting her features. The next moment, her knees buckled and she crumpled to the ground, a silent, unexpected collapse in the middle of the bustling terminal. Her luggage cart rolled away, and a half-eaten apple tumbled from her bag, rolling to a stop near his expensive leather shoes. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Andreas, Zurich, the board meeting, all vanished. Instinct took over, a primal urge to reach her, to shield her. He pushed through the small crowd that had begun to gather, their murmurs a low buzz in his ears. "Sarah!" he called out, his voice rough with a sudden surge of panic he hadn't felt in years. He knelt beside her, the fine wool of his trousers pressing into the grimy floor. His carefully constructed composure was cracking. Her eyes were closed, her face pale and damp with a cold sweat. He gently brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, his fingers trembling slightly. A young woman with kind eyes and a name tag identifying her as Airport Assistance, Maria, rushed over. "I saw her looking unwell, sir," Maria said, her voice hushed. She was swaying for a moment. "Should we call for medical assistance?" "Yes, immediately," Charles commanded, his voice regaining its familiar authority despite the tremor in his hands. He carefully cradled Sarah's head, his mind racing. What was wrong? Why was she here? And the undeniable, terrifying truth of her pregnancy hung heavy in the air between them, a secret waiting to be unveiled. The sterile environment of the airport terminal suddenly felt suffocating, filled with unspoken words and the heavy weight of their shared history. This chance encounter, this sudden crisis, felt less like an accident and more like a cruel twist of fate, a collision course set long ago. His life, so meticulously ordered and controlled, was about to be thrown into chaos once more, and the epicenter was the woman lying unconscious in his arms. The ambulance ride was a blur of wailing sirens and the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor. Charles sat on the small bench, his world shrunk to the confines of the vehicle, the scent of antiseptic sharp in his nostrils. He hadn't let go of Sarah's hand. Her fingers were cold in his, her stillness a terrifying counterpoint to the frantic energy of the paramedics. He answered their questions in clipped, efficient tones. Her name, Serafina Bellwether. Her age, 32. No known allergies that he could recall. When they asked for her emergency contact, he gave his own name without hesitation, ignoring the bitter irony. He was the emergency she had spent 3 years trying to escape. At Lenox Hill Hospital, he was relegated to a sterile waiting room while they wheeled her away. The chair was stiff. The coffee from the vending machine tasted like burnt plastic. But he didn't notice. He just stared at the double doors she'd disappeared through, his mind a chaotic whirlwind of calculations and regrets. 8 months. It had been 8 months since that disastrous charity gala. He'd been drunk on champagne and success after closing the biggest deal of his career. She was there with a friend, looking radiant in a simple blue dress that had made every other woman in the room seem overwrought. They had fallen into the old, familiar rhythm of conversation, the shared jokes, the unspoken understanding. One drink led to another, and he'd convinced her to share a cab, a final nightcap. It was a mistake, a moment of weakness for them both, a desperate grasp for a comfort that no longer existed. They had woken the next morning, tangled in the sheets of his penthouse bed, the air thick with regret. They hadn't spoken since, until today. A doctor with tired eyes and a kind face finally emerged. "Mr. Vance?" Charles was on his feet instantly. "How is she? Is the baby okay?" The question slipped out before he could stop it, a raw admission of his deepest fear. The doctor, a woman named Dr. Orris, offered a small, reassuring smile. "Your wife is stable. She was suffering from severe dehydration and exhaustion, which led to the fainting spell. It's not uncommon, but it's something we need to monitor. The baby's heartbeat is strong and steady. She's about 34 weeks along, it seems. 34 weeks. The math clicked into place with horrifying precision. Charles felt the floor drop out from under him. His baby. The abstract possibility had become a concrete, terrifying reality. He had a child. He was going to be a father. He, the man who had told Sarah he wasn't ready for a family, who had claimed his career was his only child, was about to have a daughter or a son with the woman he had let go. My wife? Charles corrected himself, his voice hoarse. Ex-wife. We're divorced. Dr. Arris's professional smile didn't falter, but a flicker of understanding crossed her eyes. I see. Well, she's awake now, though still a bit disoriented. She's asking for you. Room 304. He walked down the hallway in a daze, each step heavier than the last. What would he say? How could he possibly begin to address the chasm that lay between them, now occupied by the undeniable presence of their unborn child? He found her propped up against a pile of pillows, an IV drip taped to her arm. The harsh hospital lighting leached the color from her face, but her eyes were sharp, clear, and fixed on him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. It was a mixture of fear, anger, and a profound weariness. Charles, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Sarah, he replied, his own voice sounding foreign to his ears. He stood awkwardly by the door. The doctor said you're okay. Dehydrated. She gave a short, humorless laugh. That's the clinical term for it. I'd call it running on fumes for 3 months straight trying to finish a project before the baby comes. Her hand rested protectively on her stomach, a gesture that sent another shock wave through him. Why didn't you tell me? The question was a raw plea, stripped of his usual boardroom bluster. Sarah, why? Her gaze hardened. Tell you what, Charles, that our one-night mistake had consequences. What would have been the point? So you could send a check, assign a junior associate from your legal team to handle the situation? I know how you operate. I am not, and I will never again be, an item on your agenda. Every word was a perfectly aimed dart, striking at the heart of his guilt. Because she was right. A year ago, that might have been exactly what he would have done. He saw people, problems and solutions, assets and liabilities. That's not fair, he said, though his own conscience screamed that it was. Isn't it? She shot back, her voice gaining strength. You made your choice 3 years ago. You chose the gleaming towers, the endless meetings, the name on the side of a building. You didn't have room for a wife, let alone this. She gestured to her belly. I learned my lesson. I decided to do this on my own. I don't need anything from you. You collapsed in an airport, Sarah. You're alone, and you're pregnant with my child. You clearly need something, he argued, his frustration mounting. This was a problem, and his entire life was geared towards solving problems. I need you to leave, she said, her voice cracking with the effort of her composure. The doctor said I can go home in the morning once the fluids are done. A friend is coming to get me. Thank you for being there at the airport. Now, you can go back to your world, and I'll go back to mine. She turned her head to face the window, a clear dismissal. But Charles didn't move. Leaving was the one thing he couldn't do. Not this time. He looked at her. The fierce pride, the stubborn independence, the vulnerability she tried so desperately to hide. And for the first time in a very long time, he didn't see a problem to be managed. He saw the woman he'd loved, the woman he had wronged, and the mother of his child. And he knew, with a certainty that terrified him, that their worlds had just collided with the force of a supernova, and nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning, Charles bypassed his office, instructing his assistant to cancel his entire day. The markets could open without him. For the first time in a decade, something felt more important than the bottom line. He drove his sleek, black Audi R8, not to his gleaming skyscraper in Midtown, but towards the unfamiliar, tree-lined streets of Brooklyn. He'd gotten Sarah's address from a quick, discreet search, an invasion of privacy he'd justified as a necessity. Finding her building in Cobble Hill was a shock to his system. It was a charming, if slightly weathered brownstone, but it was a world away from the opulent, tri-level penthouse she had once shared with him. He found her on the third-floor walk-up, the door slightly ajar. He could hear voices from inside. "I'm telling you, Izzy, I'm fine. It was just a scare." That was Sarah's voice, strained but determined. A scare. "Sarah, you fainted in an airport. You're 34 weeks pregnant, and you look like you haven't slept in a month. You can't keep doing this alone," another voice replied, sharp with a fierce, protective love. Charles knocked softly on the doorframe. A woman with fiery red hair pulled into a messy bun, and paint smudges on her cheek turned to face him, her eyes narrowing with instant suspicion. This had to be Izzy. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone making it clear she'd rather do anything but. She positioned herself between him and Sarah, a human shield. Sarah sighed, pushing herself up from a worn-out armchair. "Izzy, it's fine. This is Charles Toney. Charles, this is my best friend, Isabel Diaz." "I know who he is," Izzy said, her gaze sweeping over Charles's expensive suit with disdain. "I was the one who helped her pack when he decided his balance sheets were more important than his marriage vows." Charles flinched but held her gaze. "Ms. Diaz, I just came to see how Sarah was doing." "She's fine. No thanks to you," Izzy shot back. "Izzy, please," Sarah pleaded softly. She looked exhausted, the argument draining her of what little energy she had. Charles's eyes took in the apartment. It was small but filled with character. Canvases leaned against the walls, sketches were pinned to a corkboard, and the air smelled faintly of turpentine and lavender. It was quintessentially Sarah. But he also saw the peeling paint near the window, the old radiator that probably clanked all winter, and the sheer number of stairs she had to climb every day. A wave of guilt, sharp and acidic, washed over him. This was her life after him. "Sarah, we need to talk," he said, his voice low and serious. "Alone." Izzy looked ready to protest, but Sarah gave her a look, a silent communication that passed between them. With a final venomous glare at Charles, Izzy grabbed her purse. "I'll be right downstairs at the coffee shop. You text me if you need anything." The emphasis was a clear threat. The moment the door clicked shut, the silence in the small apartment was deafening. "What do you want, Charles?" Sarah asked, wrapping her arms around her middle. He took a step closer, his hands shoved into his pockets to stop himself from reaching for her. "I saw your apartment. I saw the stairs. Sarah, this is not a suitable place for you to be right now. Not in your condition." Her eyes flashed with anger. "Don't you dare. Don't you dare come into my home and criticize it. This place is more of a home than that sterile museum you live in ever was. I have a community here. I have friends. I have a life that I built myself. I'm not criticizing it," he said, trying to modulate his tone. "I'm being practical. You need rest. You need to be taken care of. You fainted yesterday from exhaustion. And your solution is what? To throw money at it? That's always the solution, isn't it?" "My solution," he said, taking a deep breath, "is for you to come and live with me. At the penthouse. Until the baby is born." Sarah stared at him as if he had just sprouted a second head. Then she let out a laugh, a bitter, incredulous sound. "You cannot be serious. Live with you? In that gilded cage? The place where I slowly became invisible? Absolutely not. Think about the baby, Sarah," he pressed, knowing it was his only leverage. "The penthouse has an elevator. I can hire a private nurse, a chef, to make sure you're eating properly. You'll have round-the-clock care. Anything you need. It's the safest, most logical option." "Logical," she repeated, the word tasting like poison. "That's all I ever was to you, wasn't it? A logical accessory to the life of Charles Toney. When I ceased to be logical, when I started having needs and wants that didn't align with your 5-year plan, I was discarded. Now the baby is a logical problem that needs the Charles Toney solution. I won't be managed, Charles, and neither will my child." He could see the walls going up, higher and stronger than ever before. He was losing her, saying all the wrong things. His usual tactics of logic and overwhelming force were useless here. This wasn't a boardroom negotiation. "It's not about managing you," he said, his voice softer now, tinged with a desperation he rarely showed. "It's about responsibility. It's my child, too. Please, Sarah, don't do this out of pride. Do it for the baby's health. Let me do this one thing right." He saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. The mention of the baby's health was a direct hit to her greatest vulnerability. She was fiercely protective, and he knew her own well-being would always be secondary to the child's. She looked around her small, beloved apartment, then back at him, her expression a mask of conflict. The power imbalance between them was a tangible thing in the room. His wealth, his influence, his ability to provide a level of security she couldn't, versus her fierce, fragile independence. His offer wasn't just an offer. It was a reminder of everything she'd lost and everything he still possessed. Accepting it would feel like surrender. Refusing it would feel like risking her child's welfare out of spite. He had her trapped, and they both knew it. The silence stretched for a full minute, thick with the weight of 3 years of resentment and a future that was terrifyingly uncertain. Sarah walked over to the window that overlooked the street, her back to him. Charles could see the tension in her shoulders, the slight tremble in her hands as she rested them on the sill. "If I agree to this," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "there are rules, conditions." A wave of relief, so potent it almost made him dizzy, washed over Charles. "Anything," he said, trying to keep the eagerness out of his voice. She turned to face him, her eyes clear and resolute. "First, this is not a reconciliation. We are not getting back together. This is a temporary housing arrangement for the health and safety of the baby. Nothing more." "Understood," he said, his nod sharp and businesslike. "Second, I am not your guest. I am not your patient. I am a co-parent living in a shared space. That means I have autonomy. I come and go as I please. I see my friends. I live my life. Of course. Third," she continued, taking a steadying breath, "you will not try to fix my life. You will not interfere with my work, my friends, or my plans for after the baby is born. You will not throw your money around to solve problems that aren't yours to solve." This one stung, but he nodded again. "Agreed. And finally," she said, her voice dropping, becoming more vulnerable, "you will be present. If you're going to do this, you do it. You don't delegate it to an assistant or a nurse. You show up. You go to the appointments. You learn how to do this. Otherwise, there's no point." This was the condition that hit him the hardest. It wasn't about his money or his resources. It was about his time, his attention, the very things he had withheld from her throughout their marriage. It was the one thing he couldn't easily provide. But looking at her, at the determined set of her jaw and the quiet plea in her eyes, he knew it was the only thing that mattered. "I will," he promised. And for the first time, It felt less like a negotiation and more like a vow. The move-in 2 days later was an exercise in surreal awkwardness. Sarah arrived with 2 suitcases and a box of art supplies, a collection of belongings that looked comically small in the cavernous, marble-floored foyer of his penthouse. The apartment, with its floor-to-ceiling windows, minimalist furniture, and curated impersonal art, had always been his sanctuary, a monument to his success. Now, seeing it through her eyes, it felt cold, sterile, and lonely. He showed her to one of the guest suites, a sprawling room with a king-sized bed and a private balcony overlooking Central Park. "I hope this is comfortable," he said, setting her bags down. "It's bigger than my entire apartment," she murmured, looking around with a detached air, as if she were a tourist in a luxury hotel. "It will do." The first few days were a quiet, careful dance. They coexisted in the vast space, speaking only when necessary. Charles arranged for healthy gourmet meals to be delivered, which Sarah ate quietly, often taking her plate to her room. He worked mostly from his home office. The door closed, but he found his mind constantly drifting, listening for the sound of her footsteps in the hallway. He kept his promise. He cleared his schedule for her next prenatal appointment. Sitting in the waiting room, surrounded by beaming couples, he felt profoundly out of place. He was Charles Toney, a man who commanded boardrooms, yet he had never felt so inept. Inside the examination room, Dr. Aris was warm and professional. When she put the ultrasound wand on Sarah's belly, a miraculous image appeared on the screen. A tiny, perfect silhouette, a fluttering heartbeat that filled the silent room. Charles leaned forward, mesmerized. He saw a tiny hand, a perfectly formed spine. This was real. This was his child. A strange, unfamiliar emotion welled up in his chest, a powerful mix of awe and terror. He glanced at Sarah and saw a tear slide down her cheek. Without thinking, he reached out and covered her hand with his. Her fingers tensed for a moment, then, surprisingly, relaxed, her hand turning slightly to grip his. It was a small, fleeting connection, but it was the first crack in the wall of ice between them. That evening, he found her in the living room, sketching in a notepad. The city lights twinkled below them like a carpet of fallen stars. "The doctor said everything looks perfect," he said, standing a safe distance away. "Yes," she replied, not looking up from her drawing. "They asked if we have a name picked out," he ventured. She finally looked up, her expression unreadable. "I've been thinking about Eleanor, after my grandmother." "Eleanor," he repeated, testing the name on his tongue. "It's beautiful, strong." "She was an artist, too," Sarah said softly, "fiercely independent. Never let anyone tell her she couldn't do something." The unspoken message was clear. A comfortable silence fell between them for the first time. It wasn't the tense, angry silence of the past, but something softer, more contemplative. Charles watched her hand move across the page, the charcoal creating life out of nothing. He remembered how he used to love watching her draw, how he'd once found her passion for art so captivating, before he'd started seeing it as a hobby, a distraction from the real world of business and profit. Later that night, unable to sleep, he walked past her room and saw the door was ajar. A soft light spilled into the hallway. Peeking in, he saw she had fallen asleep in the armchair, her sketchbook open in her lap. He crept in quietly, intending to wake her, but stopped. On the page was a stunningly detailed sketch of a baby's hand curled around a larger finger. His finger. He had been her subject. Gently, he lifted the blanket from the bed and draped it over her shoulders. She stirred slightly, murmuring something in her sleep, but didn't wake. He stood there for a long moment, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest, the soft glow of the lamp illuminating the curve of her stomach. The truce was fragile, the wounds still deep, but in the quiet stillness of the penthouse, surrounded by the sleeping city, Charles felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. Weeks bled into a month. A strange domestic rhythm began to form within the cold glass walls of the penthouse. Charles found himself adjusting his schedule, making sure he was home for dinner, a meal they now often shared at the vast dining table, the space between them slowly shrinking. Their conversations were tentative, circling around safe topics: the baby, the weather, a new art exhibit Sarah wanted to see. They were like two strangers learning a new language, each word carefully chosen to avoid stepping on the landmines of their past. Sarah, in turn, began to emerge from her shell. She transformed the sterile guest suite into a small studio, the scent of oil paints now mingling with the penthouse's minimalist aesthetic. She was working on a series of paintings for a local charity auction, and Charles would often find himself pausing by her open door, watching her work, captivated by the intensity and passion he had so carelessly dismissed years ago. One evening she was particularly animated, her face glowing with a rare, unreserved excitement. "I had the most wonderful day," she announced over dinner. "I finalized the curriculum for the fall session at the Bridgewater Arts Collective. We got a small grant, so we can finally afford new pottery wheels for the kids." "The Bridgewater Arts Collective?" Charles asked, his attention only half present as he scrolled through market reports on his tablet. "It's a community center. Downtown," she explained, her eyes shining. "I teach art there twice a week. It's for underprivileged kids, a safe place for them to go after school. You should see them, Charles. Some of them have such difficult lives, but when they pick up a paintbrush, they just come alive. It's the most important work I've ever done." "That sounds nice," he said, his response polite but distracted. He registered the name Bridgewater, but it was a common one, and it didn't connect with the dozens of project code names floating in his mind. He was in the final stages of a massive, hostile takeover of a rival real estate firm, a deal that consumed his every waking thought. "It's more than nice," she said, the light in her eyes dimming slightly at his lukewarm response. "It's a lifeline for those kids. And for me." He put his tablet down, sensing the shift in her mood. "I'm sorry, I was distracted. Tell me more about it." She did. And for the next hour, he listened. He learned about the leaky roof, the dedicated volunteers, and the incredible raw talent of a 12-year-old girl named Maya, who painted murals with the skill of a seasoned artist. For the first time, he saw a side of Sarah's life that he had never been privy to, a world built on community and passion, so different from his own, which was built on leverage and acquisitions. And a part of him felt a pang of something that felt dangerously like envy. 2 days later, Charles was in his home office, the city spread out beneath him like a circuit board. His CFO, Julian Thorne, a man as sharp and unforgiving as the cut of his suits, was on the large video screen. "The board has approved the final financing for Project Nightingale," Julian said, his voice crisp and devoid of emotion. "Once the acquisition of Sterling Properties is complete, we can begin demolition." "Excellent," Charles replied, initialing a stack of documents. "What's the timeline for clearing the site?" 6 weeks, max. The tenants have been served their final notices. The only holdout is that dilapidated community center on the corner, but their lease is ironclad for another month. It's an insignificant delay. By October, the entire Bridgewater block will be flattened and ready for our new luxury condo tower. Charles froze, his pen hovering over the paper. "The Bridgewater block. Community center," Sarah's excited voice echoed in his mind. "It's a community center, downtown, the Bridgewater Arts Collective, a cold dread, far more chilling than any market fluctuation, seeped into his bones. It couldn't be. It was a coincidence. He pulled up the project files on his screen, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He clicked on the site map, zooming in on the plot of land designated for his flagship 80-story skyscraper. And there it was, in crisp architectural lettering, occupying the corner of Madison and 3rd, the Bridgewater Community Building. The air left his lungs. Project Nightingale, the crowning achievement of his career, the deal that would cement his legacy, was set to demolish Sarah's sanctuary. He was about to destroy the one thing that gave her purpose, the lifeline she had spoken of with such passion. "Charles, is there a problem?" Julian's voice cut through the fog of his shock. "No," Charles managed to say, his own voice sounding distant and strained. "No problem at all, Julian. Proceed as planned." He hung up the call, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the blueprints on his screen. It was a fortress of glass and steel, a monument to his ambition. And to build it, he had to tear down her world. The fragile truce he had so carefully built with Sarah was based on a lie. He was keeping a secret that was not just a betrayal of her trust, but an act of catastrophic destruction aimed at the very heart of her life. He had promised her he wouldn't interfere, that he wouldn't try to fix things. But this was so much worse. He was the bulldozer, the wrecking ball, the faceless corporation she and her community were fighting against. He closed his eyes, the psychological conflict tearing him apart. The old Charles, the ruthless businessman, screamed at him that it was just a building, a sunk cost, an unfortunate but necessary casualty of progress. The deal was worth billions. But the new Charles, the man who had held her hand during an ultrasound and felt a flicker of hope, knew this was a test. He was living a double life under his own roof. Every shared meal, every quiet conversation was now tainted by this monstrous secret. He had a choice to make, and he knew, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that either path would lead to devastation. He could either lose the deal of a lifetime, or he could lose her and the child she carried, for good. The next week was a special kind of hell for Charles. He walked through his own home like a ghost, the weight of his secret a physical burden. He was overly solicitous, constantly asking Sarah if she needed anything, his kindness a desperate, pathetic attempt to preemptively atone for the betrayal he was about to commit. Sarah, sensing his strange behavior, grew wary. The tentative warmth that had begun to grow between them cooled, replaced by her old, familiar suspicion. "Is everything all right at work, Charles?" she asked one evening, her eyes searching his face. "You seem tense." "Just a complex deal," he lied, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. A lot of moving parts. The lie was a poison, seeping into every interaction. He felt like a fraud, living under the same roof as the woman whose world he was methodically planning to dismantle. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Sarah had gone to the Bridgewater Center for her afternoon class. Charles was in his office, staring at the final demolition order that needed his signature, when his phone buzzed. It was Izzy. He rarely spoke to her, and his first instinct was that something was wrong with Sarah or the baby. He answered immediately. "Vance," he said, his voice tight. "You son of a bitch!" Izzy's voice crackled with pure fury. There was no preamble, no greeting. "You absolute, calculating son of a bitch!" "What are you talking about?" Charles asked, though a cold dread was already spreading through his chest. "Don't play dumb with me. I'm standing here with Sarah at Bridgewater. She just found this." There was a rustling sound, then Izzy's voice, reading aloud with venomous precision. Final notice of eviction and demolition, pursuant to the acquisition of this property by Vance Acquisitions. The world stopped. Sarah's a wreck, you bastard, Izzy continued, her voice breaking with rage and sorrow. She's standing here, in the middle of her classroom, surrounded by the paintings her kids made, holding a piece of paper with your name on it that says you're going to tear it all down. She defended you to me, you know that. She said you were changing. She actually started to believe it. Charles could hear muffled sobs in the background. Sarah's sobs. The sound shattered what was left of his composure. Izzy, let me talk to her, he pleaded. She doesn't want to talk to you. She wants you to go to hell. The line went dead. Charles shot up from his desk, grabbing his car keys. He raced down to the garage, his mind a maelstrom of panic and self-loathing. He had been a coward. He should have told her. He should have fixed it. He drove through the city, the rain lashing against his windshield, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. When he arrived at the Bridgewater Arts Collective, the scene was worse than he could have imagined. The building was old, but full of life, its brick walls covered in a vibrant, sprawling mural. Inside, the main room was a chaotic, beautiful mess of art supplies, half-finished projects, and children's paintings taped to every available surface. And in the center of it all stood Sarah. She was surrounded by a small group of volunteers and Izzy, who had her arm wrapped protectively around her. Sarah's face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, and filled with a look of such profound betrayal that it physically hurt him to see. She was holding the eviction notice, the paper crumpled in her white-knuckled grip. When she saw him, she took a step back, as if he were something contagious. "Sarah," he began, his voice hoarse. "Let me explain." "Explain?" she repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "Explain what, Charles?" "That this entire time you've been living with me, playing the part of the concerned father-to-be, you were secretly planning to bulldoze my life's work? Was this all some kind of sick joke?" "No, it wasn't like that," he stammered, feeling the eyes of everyone in the room on him. "The deal was in motion long before I knew about the baby, before you moved in." "But you knew," she whispered, the words cutting through the air like shards of glass. "For weeks, you've known. You sat at dinner and listened to me talk about this place, about my kids, about how much it meant to me. You listened, and you said nothing. You let me believe you were changing. You let me start to trust you again." A single tear traced a path down her cheek, and it felt like a condemnation. "That's the cruelest part, Charles," she said, her voice finally breaking. "It wasn't just about the building. You let me hope. You used this baby to get back into my life, and you made me believe it was real. But it was just another acquisition. I was just another asset to be managed while you finalized your precious deal." "That's not true," he insisted, taking a step toward her. Izzy stepped in front of him. "Don't you come any closer." "Sarah, please," he begged, looking past Izzy, his eyes only on his ex-wife. "I can fix this." She let out a hollow, broken laugh. "Fix it? Like you fix everything? With money? You can't fix this, Charles. You can't write a check to repair trust. You've just proven to me that you are, and always will be, the same man I divorced. The man who is incapable of seeing anything beyond the next deal." She dropped the crumpled notice onto the floor. "Get out," she said, her voice devoid of all its former warmth. "Get out of my building. And when I get back to your penthouse, my bags will be packed. This arrangement, this fragile truce. It's over." She turned her back on him then, a final, irrevocable dismissal. And as Charles stood there, dripping rainwater onto the paint-splattered floor, surrounded by the vibrant life he was set to destroy, He knew he hadn't just lost a deal or a building. He had lost his last chance. The trust he had just started to rebuild had not just been broken. It had been pulverized, turned to dust, just like the building he now stood in was destined to be. Charles drove back to the penthouse in a daze, the city lights blurring into streaks of neon through the rain-slicked windshield. Sarah's words echoed in his head. "You are, and always will be, the same man I divorced." The accusation settled deep in his bones, a cold, heavy truth he could no longer deny. He had tried to compartmentalize his life, Charles the businessman and Charles the expectant father. But the walls had come crashing down, and the wreckage was catastrophic. When he entered the penthouse, it was silent and still. A packed suitcase and a box of art supplies stood by the door like solemn sentinels. He found Sarah in the guest room, now stripped of her personal touches, methodically folding the last of her clothes. She didn't look at him. "You don't have to leave, Sarah," he said softly from the doorway. "Yes," she replied, her voice flat and emotionless. "I do. I can't stay here. I can't look at you. I've already called Izzy. I'll stay with her. That's not a long-term solution." "What about the baby? What about your health?" he argued, falling back on his old, practical reasoning. She finally stopped and turned to face him, her eyes empty of everything but a deep, settled pain. "I will figure it out. I was figuring it out before you reappeared in my life, and I will figure it out after you're gone. What I won't do is live with a man I can't trust. It's not healthy for me, and it's certainly not healthy for this baby." Every word was a nail in the coffin of his hope. He had broken something fundamental between them, something that all his money and power could never hope to repair. He watched, helpless, as she zipped up her bag and walked past him without a word, heading for the door. The quiet click of the lock as she left was the loudest sound he had ever heard. The penthouse, once his sanctuary of success, now felt like a tomb. The silence was immense, suffocating. He wandered through the rooms, seeing traces of her everywhere. A faint scent of lavender in the guest room, a half-finished glass of water on the nightstand, a charcoal smudge on a pillowcase. He had gotten what he wanted. He had the space all to himself again. And he had never felt more alone. The next morning, Julian Thorne was waiting for him at the office, a triumphant look on his face. "Sterling Properties has officially folded. The final papers are on your desk. Project Nightingale is a go. We're hosting a press conference at noon to announce it." Charles looked at the sleek architectural model of the proposed tower that sat in the corner of his office. It was a masterpiece of design, a symbol of power and wealth. A week ago, he would have looked at it with immense pride. Today, all he saw was a tombstone for a community center and the grave of his relationship with Sarah. "Cancel the press conference," Charles said, his voice quiet but firm. Julian stared at him. "What?" "Charles, this is our biggest victory, the culmination of 2 years of work." "I said cancel it," Charles repeated, walking over to the window and looking down at the city below. He could just make out the district where the Bridgewater Center stood. "And get the project team on a conference call. I want to see the financials on pulling out of the Bridgewater demolition." Julian's face went pale. "Pulling out? Are you insane? We've already sunk over $200 million into acquisitions and planning, not to mention the penalty clauses for breaking the Sterling contract. It would be financial suicide. Our stock would plummet. The board would have your head. Just get me the numbers, Julian," Charles said, his tone leaving no room for argument. For the rest of the morning, he was locked in a war. A war against his CFO, his board, and most of all, against the man he had been his entire adult life. Julian presented the numbers, and they were staggering. The losses would be catastrophic, erasing nearly a third of the company's value overnight. It was illogical, irrational, and terrible for business. It was everything the old Charles Tony would have scorned. "Don't let this woman derail an empire you've spent your life building," Julian argued, his voice laced with a genuine, baffled concern. "This isn't you, Charles." Maybe that's the point, Charles thought. After the brutal conference call, he knew he had to see it for himself, not as a developer surveying a plot of land, but as a person. He drove to the Bridgewater block, this time parking a few streets away and walking. He wore a simple jacket and a baseball cap, feeling like an intruder in a world he was about to obliterate. He stood across the street from the community center, watching as a stream of kids, laughing and shouting, poured through its doors. He saw a young boy proudly show his mother a clay pot he had made. He saw a group of teenage girls practicing a dance routine by the muraled wall. And then he saw Sarah. She was standing on a small stepladder, a paintbrush in her hand, talking to a small girl who couldn't have been more than 7. The girl, Maya, the one Sarah had told him about, was pointing to a section of the mural, and Sarah was smiling, a genuine, radiant smile that he hadn't seen in years. In that moment, she wasn't his wounded ex-wife or the mother of his child. She was a creator, a teacher, a pillar of a community that depended on her. He understood then, with a clarity that was both painful and liberating. This wasn't just a building. It was an ecosystem of hope, creativity, and safety. And he was the impending natural disaster. Sarah's words came back to him. It's a lifeline for those kids, and for me. He had spent his life building things, towers of glass and steel that housed the wealthy. But she, with far fewer resources, was building something far more valuable: futures. He turned and walked back to his car, a new, terrifying resolve hardening within him. Julian was right. The decision he was about to make was illogical and would have devastating consequences for his business. The board would be furious. The media would have a field day. But for the first time, the potential loss of money and prestige felt insignificant compared to what he stood to lose if he did nothing. This wasn't about winning her back. It was about becoming a man who was worthy of being her child's father. This was his reckoning. The emergency board meeting was convened in the top-floor conference room of Vance Tower, a space Charles himself had designed to project power. The 20-foot mahogany table, the panoramic views of the city, the hushed, reverent atmosphere. It was all meant to intimidate. Today, for the first time, he felt like the one on trial. He stood at the head of the table, facing a dozen grim-faced men and women, the titans of industry and finance who made up his board of directors. Julian Thorne sat to his right, his expression a tight mask of disapproval. The air was thick with tension. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Charles began, his voice calm and steady, belying the storm raging inside him. "As you know, we are on the verge of finalizing the largest and most profitable project in this company's history. Project Nightingale." A low murmur of agreement went around the table. "I have reviewed the final logistics, the financial projections, and the long-term impact on our portfolio," Charles continued, letting the dramatic pause hang in the air. "And I have made a decision. We are pulling out." The silence that followed was absolute, a stunned, collective intake of breath. Then, chaos erupted. "Pulling out?" exclaimed Marcus Thorne, Julian's uncle and a board member for 20 years. "That's preposterous. We have contracts. We have investors." "This is corporate malfeasance, Vance," another director shouted. "You'll be destroying shareholder value on a whim." Julian stood up, his face pale with fury. "Charles, I urge you to reconsider this madness. The financial fallout will be in the hundreds of millions. It will set this company back a decade." Charles held up a hand. and slowly the room quieted. "I am aware of the financial consequences," he said, his gaze sweeping across each and every face at the table. "I have reviewed the penalty clauses, the market impact, and the potential lawsuits. I know exactly what this will cost us." "Then why?" Marcus demanded. "Give us one good reason for this corporate suicide." Charles took a deep breath. He could give them a sanitized business reason: unforeseen community opposition, bad press. But he knew, in this moment, that he needed to tell the truth. At least a version of it. "Because some things have a value that can't be quantified on a balance sheet," he said. "The Bridgewater Block development requires the demolition of a community arts center, a center that serves hundreds of underprivileged children, that provides a sanctuary in a neighborhood that desperately needs one. It is a vital part of that community. And I have decided that Vance Acquisitions will not be the company that tears it down for a luxury high-rise." He could see the disbelief on their faces. They looked at him as if he were a stranger, speaking a foreign language. The Charles Toney they knew measured value in dollars per square foot, not in societal good. "This is not a charity, Charles," a director scoffed. "Our fiduciary duty is to our shareholders. Our duty is also to not be corporate vandals," Charles countered, his voice ringing with a conviction he hadn't known he possessed. "This company bears my name, and I will not have my name attached to the destruction of something so fundamentally good. The decision is final. We are terminating the project." He knew what this meant. It meant lawsuits, a stock crash, and a vote of no confidence that would almost certainly see him removed as CEO. He was immolating his career, torching the empire he had spent his life building. But as he looked at their avaricious, uncomprehending faces, he felt a strange sense of peace. He was finally making a choice, not just reacting to a problem. He left the boardroom without waiting for further argument, the shouts of outrage following him down the hall. He walked back to his office, ignoring Julian's frantic attempts to get his attention. He sat down at his desk and did the last, and most important thing. He picked up the phone and called Sarah. She answered on the second ring, her voice cautious. "Hello? Sarah, it's me," he said. "I have something to tell you, and I don't want you to say anything until I'm finished." He took a breath. "I'm cancelling the Bridgewater project. It's over. The demolition is not happening. Your center is safe." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. He could hear her breathing, soft and unsteady. "Why?" she finally whispered. "Because you were right," he said. The admission costing him his pride, but giving him something far more valuable in return. About me. About what I had become. And I looked at what I was about to destroy, and what I was about to build, and I didn't like the man who was making that trade. This isn't a tactic to get you back. It's not a grand gesture with an ulterior motive. I did it because it was the right thing to do. And I just wanted you to know." He could hear her take a shaky breath. "Charles, what did this cost you?" He looked out the window at the empire that was about to crumble. "Everything," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "And it was worth it." He hung up the phone, not wanting to pressure her for a response. He had done what he had to do, with no expectation of forgiveness. He had paid the price. The redemption, if it ever came, would be up to her. He leaned back in his chair, the silence of his office no longer feeling like loneliness, but like the quiet after a storm, waiting to see what, if anything, would be left to rebuild from the ruins. The fallout was immediate and brutal. The next morning, the financial news was a bloodbath. Vance Acquisitions scraps billion-dollar project, stock plummets. CEO Charles Toney's shock decision sparks shareholder revolt. Julian Thorne resigned publicly, issuing a statement that cited irreconcilable differences in corporate strategy. Charles was a pariah in the world he had once ruled. He spent the next few weeks in a self-imposed exile, methodically dismantling his own power. He negotiated with the board, agreeing to step down as CEO in exchange for them honoring the cancellation of the project. He sold a significant portion of his stock to cover the contractual penalties, his personal fortune taking a massive hit. He was shedding the skin of his old life, piece by painful piece. He didn't hear from Sarah. He hadn't expected to. He had sent her a simple text message confirming that the ownership of the Bridgewater building had been transferred to a non-profit trust, securing its future indefinitely. She had replied with 2 words: "Thank you." It was more than he deserved. One dreary afternoon, as he was packing up his personal belongings from his now former office, his phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Hello? Is this Charles Toney?" a familiar, sharp voice asked. It was Izzy. "Yes, Sarah's in labor," she said, her tone devoid of its usual animosity, replaced by a clipped urgency. "She wanted you to know. We're at Lenox Hill, room 512. The line went dead before he could respond. His heart seized. He dropped the box he was holding, its contents scattering across the floor. He ran, not bothering with the elevator, taking the stairs 2 at a time, driven by a primal, desperate need to be there. He found the room and paused at the door, his hand hovering over the handle. What if she didn't want him in there? What if he was just another complication? He took a breath and pushed the door open. Sarah was on the bed, her face pale with exhaustion, her hair damp with sweat. Izzy was by her side, holding her hand. When Sarah saw him, her expression wasn't angry or resentful. It was something else entirely. A deep, weary vulnerability. "You came," she breathed between contractions. "Of course I came," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He walked over to the other side of the bed. Izzy looked from him to Sarah, then nodded. "I'm going to go get some coffee," she said, squeezing Sarah's hand before she left. It was a clear, unspoken truce. For the next 8 hours, Charles stayed by her side. He held her hand, wiped her brow with a cool cloth, and murmured words of encouragement. He saw her strength, her raw, incredible power, and felt humbled. All his boardroom battles, his hostile takeovers, they were nothing compared to this. This was creation. This was life. And then, with a final, heroic push and a cry that seemed to tear through the fabric of the universe, their daughter was born. The nurse cleaned her and wrapped her in a blanket, placing the tiny, perfect bundle in Sarah's arms. She had a tuft of dark hair, just like his, and a calm, watchful expression in her deep blue eyes. She was beautiful. "Eleanor," Sarah looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears. "Do you want to hold her?" His hands trembled as he reached for his daughter. She was so small, so impossibly fragile in his arms. He looked down at her tiny face, and his world, which had been systematically dismantled over the past few weeks, was suddenly rebuilt on a new, unshakable foundation. All the ambition, the money, the power, it all melted away, meaningless in the face of this tiny miracle. He felt a tear slide down his own cheek, a baptism into this new, terrifying, wonderful world of fatherhood. The grand gesture of saving the community center hadn't been the key to forgiveness. It was this: the small, quiet moments that followed. The late nights at the hospital, when he would take the baby so Sarah could sleep. The clumsy way he learned to change a diaper. The first time Eleanor's tiny hand curled around his finger and held on tight. Sarah watched him, her gaze soft and contemplative. The anger had faded, replaced by a cautious curiosity. She saw a different man, one who was patient, gentle, and utterly devoted to their child. The healing wasn't in one big act, but in 1,000 small ones. One afternoon, a few weeks after they brought Eleanor home to Izzy's apartment, Charles arrived with a large, flat package. "What's this?" Sarah asked. "Something I wanted you to see," he said. She unwrapped it. It was a framed catalogue for a gallery exhibition. On the cover was a stunning photograph of one of her paintings, the one of the children's hands at the Bridgewater Center. The exhibit was titled Serafina Bellwether, Lifelines. She opened it, her eyes scanning the pages. It was a retrospective of her work, beautifully curated, with a date for a solo show at a prestigious Soho gallery. "How?" she whispered. "I know some people in the art world," he said with a small smile. "I didn't pay for it. I just made some calls, showed them your portfolio. They did the rest. They saw what I should have seen all along. Your talent is extraordinary, Sarah. The world deserves to see it." This was the moment. It wasn't about him saving her community center. It was about him seeing her. Not as the mother of his child, not as his ex-wife, but as an artist, as a person of immense value and talent in her own right. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they weren't tears of sorrow or betrayal. They were tears of recognition, of a deep, profound healing. Forgiveness wasn't a decision. It was a slow, quiet dawn. And for the first time in a very long time, Sarah could feel the sun on her face. 1 year later, the crisp autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves through Central Park. The cacophony of New York City felt miles away, replaced by the laughter of children and the gentle rustle of golden leaves. On a small blanket near the pond, Eleanor Vance Bellwether, now a giggling 1-year-old with her mother's expressive eyes and her father's determined chin, took a wobbly step before tumbling onto the soft grass. Sarah laughed, scooping her up into a hug. "Good job, my little adventurer." Charles, sitting beside them, smiled. He looked different now. The sharp, predatory edge was gone, replaced by a softer, more contented confidence. He had traded his bespoke suits for comfortable jeans and a sweater. After leaving Vance Acquisitions, he had started a small impact investment firm, one that focused on funding community projects and sustainable urban development. He was making a fraction of what he used to, and he had never been happier. They hadn't moved back into the sterile penthouse. Instead, they had found a beautiful, warm brownstone in Brooklyn, just a few blocks from Izzy and the Bridgewater Center, which was now thriving with new funding and attention, thanks to Sarah's successful gallery show. Their home was filled with light, art, and the happy chaos of a baby learning to walk. Their relationship had been rebuilt not on the ashes of their old marriage, but on a completely new foundation. It was a foundation built of shared late nights with a crying baby, of honest conversations about their fears and dreams, of mutual respect, and of a slow, hard-won trust. Charles reached into the picnic basket, but instead of pulling out a sandwich, he produced a small, velvet box. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. He turned to face her, his expression serious and full of a love that was deeper and more real than anything they had ever shared before. "Sarah," he began, his voice quiet but steady. "The first time I asked you to marry me, I did it all wrong. I offered you a partnership, an asset to my portfolio. I gave you a ring that was a symbol of my success, not my love. I promised you the world, but I wasn't willing to actually share my world with you." He opened the box. Inside was not a massive diamond, but a simple, elegant band with a small, uncut sapphire, the color of the sky on a clear day. "This isn't that," he continued, his eyes locked on hers. "This is a promise, not of wealth or a perfect life, but of my time, my attention, my respect, and my whole heart. It's a promise to be a true partner to you and the best father I can be to Eleanor. It's a promise to choose us every day, over any deal, any building, any ambition. He took her hand. Serafina Bellwether, you are the most incredible woman I have ever known. You rebuilt your life from scratch, and in doing so, you taught me how to rebuild mine. Will you do me the honor of building a new life with me, together, this time for good? Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she nodded, unable to speak. Yes, she finally whispered. Yes, Charles. Yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that held none of the desperate regret of their past, but all the quiet promise of their future. Eleanor babbled happily, clapping her small hands together as if she understood that her small family, once shattered, was finally, truly whole. Their wedding was not a grand affair in a 5-star hotel, but an intimate ceremony in the main room of the Bridgewater Arts Collective, surrounded by the vibrant paintings of the children whose lives they had touched. It wasn't an ending, but a beginning. A testament to the fact that sometimes you have to tear everything down to build something beautiful and strong enough to last a lifetime. Charles and Sarah's story is a powerful reminder that redemption isn't about grand gestures, but about the quiet, daily work of becoming the person you were meant to be. It shows us that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the love we give and the community we build. What did you think of Charles's incredible transformation? Could you have forgiven him? Let us know in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like, share it with someone who needs to see it, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more emotional and inspiring stories every week. Thank you for watching.